The blast hit like a thunderclap, hurling Lieutenant Ethan Carver across the razor-sharp stones of an alien wasteland. His infiltration suit absorbed the brunt of the impact, but pain seared through his body, nerves alight with protest. Blood oozed from a gash above his brow, stinging his right eye as his vision blurred. Above him, the crimson sky of Voryn territory churned, its jagged clouds twisting like a predator's grin. 4 days of flawless covert ops along the edge of the Voryn Expanse, and now this, an ambush at the extraction point. His gloved hand clawed for his pulse pistol, fingers scraping against the empty holster. The weapon lay meters away, glinting mockingly in the dim light, knocked free by the explosion. Before he could lunge for it, a shadow loomed over him, a silhouette too tall, too imposing to be human. "Stay down, vermin," a voice growled, deep and resonant, vibrating through the cracked earth. A heavy boot slammed onto his chest, pinning him with crushing force. Ethan gritted his teeth, fighting the urge to gasp as the air was squeezed from his lungs. He squinted up at his captor, a Voryn soldier, its ash-gray skin mottled with jagged scars, 3 piercing green eyes arranged in a triangle across its broad skull. The alien's armor shimmered with an eerie glow, adorned with symbols Ethan didn't recognize, but instinctively knew marked high rank. Alone for now, but others would come. He heard faint shouts in the distance, reinforcements closing in. The soldier's middle eye narrowed. Pathetic. A single human sneaking through Voryn space? Your kind must crave death more than we thought. Ethan said nothing, his mind racing back to his training. Name, rank, serial number. Give him nothing else. His silence only seemed to amuse the Voryn. With a flick of its wrist, it activated energy cuffs that snapped around Ethan's wrists, their heat biting into his skin like molten wire. The soldier yanked him to his feet, and Ethan stumbled, his head pounding from where it had struck the ground. Blood dripped steadily now, but he forced his eyes to focus, scanning the terrain. Red dunes, twisted spires of rock, a faint shimmer of a transport ship on the horizon. Escape was a long shot, but he'd take any chance he could get. The march to the ship was a blur of agony and grit. Ethan's legs burned with every step, his captor's grip unrelenting as it dragged him forward. The Voryn vessel hummed with a low, unsettling frequency that made his teeth ache, its sleek hull cutting through the atmosphere as they boarded. Inside, the air was cold, sterile, the walls lined with a strange, translucent metal that pulsed faintly, like a living thing. They shoved him into a holding cell, the door sealing with a hiss. Ethan slumped against the wall, exhaustion tugging at him, but he fought to stay sharp. "Water," he rasped, his throat raw and dry. A slot slid open, and a small canister rolled in. He crawled to it, inspecting the liquid inside, clear with a faint metallic tang. It could be poison, but dehydration would kill him faster. He took a cautious sip, then drank deeply, the coolness soothing his parched mouth. As he set the canister down, the cell door hummed and parted, revealing a sight that made his breath catch. For guards flanked a figure that radiated power, an unmistakable presence even among the towering Voryn. She stepped forward, and Ethan froze mid-motion, the canister slipping from his hand. She was taller than the others, her ash-gray skin gleaming with a subtle sheen, intricate silver markings tracing her arms like veins of liquid starlight. Her 3 eyes glowed a fierce violet, arranged in a perfect triad across her angular face, framed by a crest of bone that swept back like a crown. Her combat suit hugged her form, accentuating every curve and muscle, a blend of elegance and lethality. Twin blades hung at her hips, their edges catching the light with a deadly promise. Even without knowing Voryn hierarchy, Ethan could tell this was no ordinary soldier. This was royalty. "So, this is the human who dared trespass in my domain," she said, her voice smooth as silk yet edged with iron. She moved closer, her steps deliberate, predatory. Smaller than I imagined. Ethan pushed himself to his feet, ignoring the ache in his ribs, and met her gaze, or tried to, his head tilting back to match her towering height. "Lieutenant Ethan Carver, Terran Union Forces," he said, voice steady despite the blood streaking his face. She circled him slowly, her eyes never leaving him, the upper one narrowing while the lower two roamed his frame with unsettling intensity. "I am Sovereign Kaelith, ruler of the Voryn Expanse and subjugator of 9 worlds," she declared, stopping inches from him. Her scent hit him, something sharp like storm-charged air, mingled with a hint of something floral, intoxicating. She leaned in, her breath brushing his ear as she spoke. "And you, human, are my captive." Ethan's pulse quickened, not just from fear. Her proximity sent a shiver down his spine, her presence overwhelming yet magnetic. "I was on a sanctioned mission along the neutral zone," he said, forcing his tone to stay even. "Under the Stellar Concord, I should be returned to Union space." Kaelith's lips curved into a faint smirk, revealing teeth sharpened to subtle points. "The Concord protects diplomats and traitors, not spies." She gestured to a guard. "Was he armed?" "Yes, Sovereign," the guard replied. "Standard Union weaponry." Her smirk faded, her gaze hardening. "An act of war, then. The penalty is death." Ethan's stomach tightened, but he kept his expression blank. "Then why am I still breathing?" She stepped closer, so near he could feel the heat radiating from her. Her hand hovered over his chest, fingers brushing the edge of his torn suit, the touch light yet electric. "Because you intrigue me," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that sent a jolt through him. "You'll enter the crucible, a trial of blood and will. Survive, and you might prove useful. Fail, and you'll die like the rest." Ethan swallowed, his throat tight, her words laced with a challenge he couldn't ignore. "What's the crucible?" "A proving ground," she replied, her fingers lingering a moment longer before pulling away. "Prisoners fight for freedom or honor in death. For you, human, I predict the latter. Your kind lacks the strength to stand against us." Her eyes glinted with something unreadable, contempt, perhaps, or curiosity. She turned to the guards. "Prepare him. First trial at dusk." As she strode out, her silhouette burned into his mind. Ethan clenched his fists against the cuffs. She dismissed him as nothing, but he'd faced worse odds and walked away. If this crucible was a shot, he'd make her see humanity's worth, one way or another. The transport to the crucible was swift, the ship's engines thrumming as it descended into a sprawling complex carved from the planet's red stone. Ethan's guards shoved him into a preparation chamber, its walls lined with weapons he barely recognized, curved blades, energy staves, things meant for hands not shaped like his. "Choose," one barked. Ethan scanned the options, settling on a lightweight staff with a bladed tip. It wasn't ideal, but it fit his grip, and he could move with it. He tested its weight, spinning it once, then grabbed a small orb that pulsed faintly. A flare, maybe. It'd have to do. The guard grunted, unimpressed, but led him to the arena's edge. The crucible was massive, a pit ringed by towering stands packed with Voryn spectators, their three-eyed gazes glinting in the fading light. The floor was a chaos of obstacles, spikes, trenches, platforms, beneath a dome that glowed with the red haze of Voryn sky. Across the pit, his opponent emerged, a hulking beast called Zorik, its skin a patchwork of scales, for arms ending in claws that scraped the ground. It roared, and the crowd answered with a deafening cheer. High above, in an ornate balcony, Kaelith appeared, her presence silencing the masses. "Today we test the first human to face the crucible," she announced, her voice amplified across the arena. "Let us see if this intruder offers anything beyond weakness." Her violet eyes locked onto Ethan's, a challenge sparking in their depths. "Begin." Zora charged, its speed defying its bulk. Ethan dove aside, the claws missing him by inches as the crowd roared. He rolled to his feet, staff raised, and retreated, weaving through obstacles to buy time. Zorik was strong, fast, but its movements were rigid, predictable. Ethan let it chase him, noting how its lower eyes squinted against the arena's harsh lights. Sensitive, maybe. After dodging a flurry of strikes, Ethan backed toward a spiked pillar. Zorik lunged, claws outstretched, and Ethan hurled the flare orb at its face. A blinding flash erupted, and the beast howled, staggering back, hands clawing at its eyes. Ethan didn't hesitate. He vaulted onto a platform and drove the staff's blade into the base of Zorik's neck, a weak spot between scales. The creature collapsed, writhing, and Ethan stood over it, chest heaving, staff poised but still. The arena fell silent. He looked up at Kaelith's balcony. She rose, her expression unreadable, then raised a hand, thumb shifting upward. "The human advances," she declared, her tone flat but her eyes lingering on him with a flicker of something new. As guards escorted him out, Ethan caught her gaze again. She'd called him nothing, but that victory said otherwise. Back in a holding cell, an older Voryn prisoner, Tarak, approached him, scars crisscrossing his gray skin. "First time in the pit, human? That obvious?" Ethan asked, wiping blood from his brow. "You watch everything," Tarak said, his 3 eyes blinking in sequence. "Smart. I'm Dedek. 6 cycles here. That trick with the flare, clever. What's next?" Ethan asked. Tarak gestured to the others in the cell block. Aliens of every shape, all prisoners. "More fights. Win, you climb. Lose." He drew a claw across his throat. "But Kaelith is watching you now. She doesn't linger for most." Ethan glanced at the observation deck, where Kaelith's silhouette had vanished. "Why me?" "First human," Tarak said, voice low, "and she requested your trial herself. You're a puzzle." Ethan leaned back, the weight of her attention settling over him like a second skin. Puzzle or not, he'd survive this crucible and make her rethink every word she'd spoken. The dim hum of the holding cell greeted Ethan as the guard shoved him back inside, the door sealing with a sharp hiss. His body ached from the fight with Zorik, bruises blooming across his ribs, but adrenaline still buzzed in his veins. He'd survived the Crucible's first trial, turned Kaelith's dismissal into a question mark. Wiping sweat and blood from his face, he sank onto the cold bench, replaying her words, "The human advances." Her voice had been neutral, but those violet eyes, they'd lingered, piercing through him like a blade seeking weakness. He wasn't just a prisoner anymore. He was something she couldn't ignore. Tarak, the scarred Voryn prisoner, shuffled over, his 3 eyes glinting in the low light. "You're still breathing," he said, a rasp of approval in his tone. "Most don't make it past the first round." "Luck and a good throw," Ethan replied, flexing his stiff fingers. The memory of Zorik's collapse flashed in his mind, scales cracking under his staff, the crowd's silence swallowing the chaos. "What's the next step?" Tarak gestured toward the cell block, where other prisoners, hulking reptilians, wiry insectoids, a few humanoid but distinctly alien, watched him with guarded curiosity. "More fights. The Crucible's a ladder. Climb high enough, and Kaelith might spare you. Fall, and..." He mimed a claw slicing his throat again, a grim habit. "But you've got her attention now, human. That's rare." Ethan's gaze flicked to the observation deck, now empty. "Why is she so interested?" Tarak's middle eye narrowed. "She's always testing. Strength, cunning, whatever she can use. Voryn don't waste potential. But a human? You knew. Unpredictable. She requested your trial herself. Word spreads fast down here." Ethan leaned back, the weight of that sinking in. Sovereign Kaelith, ruler of 9 worlds, had singled him out. He wasn't sure if that was a death sentence or a lifeline, but he'd take it either way. "Then I'll keep surprising her," he said, voice low. Tarak's scarred face twisted into what might have been a grin. "Good luck, Carver. You'll need it." The next trial came at dusk, the red sky bleeding into the arena as Ethan stepped onto the pitted floor. His new opponent was a lean, serpentine creature called VYX, its body coiled with muscle, eyes glowing yellow in the dimness. It wielded a pair of curved blades that sang through the air, faster than Zorik's brute strength. Ethan clutched his staff, the same bladed one from before, and a small shot grenade he'd grabbed from the weapons rack. The crowd roared as Kaelith appeared in her balcony, her silhouette sharp against the crimson haze. "This human dares a second trial," she announced, her voice cutting through the din. "Let us see if his luck holds." Her eyes found his, and Ethan felt a jolt. Not fear, but something hotter, sharper, like a current running through him. He shook it off, focusing on VYX as the signal sounded. The serpent struck first, blades slashing in a blur. Ethan ducked and rolled, the staff a lifeline as he parried a strike that nearly took his arm. VYX was relentless, its coils propelling it across the arena with unnatural grace. Ethan retreated, drawing it toward a cluster of spiked obstacles, his mind racing. It was fast but overeager. Every lunge left a split-second opening. He let it chase him, feinting a stumble, then hurled the shock grenade at its feet. The blast crackled, and VYX hissed, momentarily stunned. Ethan lunged, driving the staff's blade into the base of its tail. A nerve cluster, he'd guessed right. The creature crumpled, and the crowd erupted. Breathing hard, Ethan looked up. Kaelith stood motionless, her thumb rising slowly. "He advances again," she said, and this time, a faint curve touched her lips. As the guards led him out, Ethan felt her gaze on his back, heavy and inescapable. Days blurred into a rhythm of blood and survival. Ethan fought 3 more trials, each opponent stranger, deadlier than the last. A hulking brute with armored plates, a skittering thing with venomous barbs, a humanoid with telekinetic tricks. Each time, he adapted, using the arena's terrain, their weaknesses, his dwindling stock of tricks. Each time, he won. The prisoners whispered his name now, Carver, echoing through the cell block like a talisman. Tarak watched with growing respect, offering scraps of advice between fights. That one hates light. This one's slow to turn. Ethan soaked it all in, his body battered, but his mind sharp. After the 5th victory, the guards didn't take him back to the cell. Instead, they marched him through gleaming corridors of polished stone, past towering statues of Voryn warriors, into a chamber that stole his breath. The walls shimmered with silver veins, the air thick with a faint, floral scent. A table stood at the center, laden with strange foods, glistening fruits, steaming platters, a goblet of amber liquid. And there, by a massive window overlooking a city of jagged spires, stood Kaelith. She'd shed her combat suit for robes that flowed like liquid shadow, clinging to her form in ways that made Ethan's pulse stumble. The silver markings on her arms pulsed faintly, catching the light as she turned. "Lieutenant Carver," she said, her voice softer now, though no less commanding. "You've proven persistent." Ethan straightened, ignoring the ache in his shoulders. "I'm hard to kill, Sovereign." Her lips twitched, almost a smile. "So I see." She gestured to the table. "Join me." The guards withdrew, leaving them alone. Ethan hesitated, then sat, the chair molding to his frame. Kaelith took the head of the table, her movements fluid, deliberate. A server appeared, placing a plate before him, something that looked like seared meat, its aroma rich and unfamiliar. "Our scans say this suits your biology," she said, lifting her goblet. "Try it." He took a bite, the flavor bursting across his tongue, savory, then sweet, then spiced. "It's good," he admitted, meeting her gaze. "But I'm guessing this isn't just a reward." Her upper eye narrowed, the lower two fixed on him with that unnerving focus. "Perceptive. The crucible isn't only punishment, Carver. It's a crucible in truth, forging tools, weapons, minds. You've survived where others falter. I want to know why." Ethan set his fork down, leaning forward slightly. "Humans don't have claws or scales. We think our way out of corners. Adapt or die." She studied him, then rose, circling the table until she stood beside him. Her shadow fell over him, her scent, storm and flowers, filling his senses. "Adaptation," she murmured, testing the word. She reached out, her fingers brushing his jaw, tilting his head up. The touch was firm, warm, sending a spark through him. "Is that all you offer?" His breath hitched, but he held her gaze. It's kept me alive so far. Her fingers lingered, tracing the edge of his jaw before pulling back, leaving heat in their wake. Tomorrow, you'll face Karath, a champion unbeaten in 4 cycles. Strength alone won't save you. She stepped closer, her hip brushing his shoulder as she leaned down, her voice a low whisper against his ear. Impress me again, human, and we'll see what else you're worth. Ethan's heart pounded, her proximity a live wire against his skin. He turned his head, their faces inches apart, her violet eyes boring into his. I don't plan on losing, he said, voice rough. For a moment, neither moved, the air between them crackling. Then she straightened, breaking the spell, and swept toward the door. Rest well, she called over her shoulder. You'll need it. The next morning, Ethan woke in a new cell, Noah's suite. The hard bench was gone, replaced by a cushioned platform that cradled his sore muscles. The walls glowed softly, the air clean and faintly sweet. His wounds had been dressed with a translucent film that tingled as it healed him, and beside the bed lay fresh clothes, dark, fitted fabric that felt like silk against his battered skin. He dressed, testing his range of motion, when Tarak appeared at the door, clad in formal Voryn attire instead of prisoner rags. You're moving up, Tarak said, his 3 eyes blinking in sequence. Kaelith's orders. You're in the spire now, her secondary stronghold. Ethan frowned, adjusting the tunic. Still a prisoner? A guest, Tarak corrected. Different leash, same game. She wants you at a briefing after the trial. Karath is your next hurdle, big, fast, regenerates. Watch his left flank, it's weaker. Ethan nodded, filing that away. And you're not just a prisoner, are you? Tarak's grin returned. I serve her in ways you'll learn. Dress fast, she hates waiting. Left alone, Ethan explored the suite. A bathing chamber with steaming pools, windows overlooking manicured grounds ringed by high walls. A gilded cage, but he'd take it. He bathed quickly, the hot water easing his aches, then followed Tarak through the spire's gleaming halls to a training chamber. The walls pulsed with energy, and aliens of every kind sparred in sections, preparing for their own trials. Kaelith entered moments later, her combat suit back, her presence silencing the room. Carver, she said, striding toward him. Today, you train with me. Ethan's stomach flipped, but he squared his shoulders. Ready when you are. She smirked, tossing him a practice staff. Prove it. They circled each other, the air thick with tension. She lunged first, her staff a blur, and Ethan parried, the impact jarring his arms. She was fast, too fast, but he held his ground, dodging and striking where he could. Then she closed the distance, her body slamming into his, pinning him against the wall. Her chest pressed to his, her breath hot against his neck as she growled. You're slow, human. Ethan twisted, flipping her off him, their bodies tangled for a heartbeat longer than necessary. He pinned her instead, his hands gripping her wrists, their faces close enough to feel each other's heat. Fast enough, he shot back, voice low. Her eyes flared, and for a moment, he thought she'd push back, or pull him closer. Then she laughed, a sound that vibrated through him, and broke free. Not bad, she said, stepping back, but her gaze lingered, heavy with something unspoken. The training chamber buzzed with a murmur of onlookers as Kaelith stepped back, her violet eyes still locked on Ethan's. Her laugh lingered in the air, a rare sound that rippled through the tension between them. She twirled the practice staff in her hand, her movements fluid, almost taunting. You've got spirit, Carver, she said, her tone laced with something that wasn't quite mockery, something closer to intrigue. Let's see if it holds against Karath. Ethan wiped sweat from his brow, the ache in his arms a dull throb. Tell me about him. She tilted her head, the silver markings on her arms catching the light as she moved closer again. Karath is a legend, 7 feet of muscle and rage. He heals faster than you can cut him. Last cycle, he crushed a Tellarine warrior in under 5 minutes. Her voice dropped, her breath brushing his ear as she leaned in. You'll need more than tricks this time. Her proximity sent a shiver down his spine, her scent, storm and flowers, flooding his senses. He held his ground, resisting the urge to step back or closer. "I've got more than tricks," he said, meeting her gaze. "You'll see." Her lips curved, a flicker of amusement in her three-eyed stare. "I look forward to it." She turned sharply, gesturing to the guards. "Take him to the arena." Dusk approaches. The crucible was alive with anticipation as Ethan stepped onto the pitted floor once more. The stands overflowed with Voryn spectators, their cheers a deafening roar that vibrated through his boots. He gripped his staff tighter, the bladed tip gleaming under the red sky, and checked the shock grenade tucked into his belt. Across the arena, Karoth emerged, a mountain of gray flesh, his forearms flexing with corded muscle, his eyes glowing a sickly yellow. Scars crisscrossed his body, proof of battles won, and he carried no weapon. He didn't need one. Kaelith's voice rang out from her balcony, sharp and commanding. "Tonight, the human faces Karoth, undefeated champion of the Crucible. Prove your worth, Carver, or die trying." Her eyes found his, and Ethan felt that same jolt, a mix of challenge and something deeper tugging at him. The signal blared, and Karoth charged, earth shaking under his weight. Ethan dodged left, the first swing of a massive fist grazing his shoulder, sending a shockwave of pain through him. He rolled, putting a trench between them, and studied Karoth's movements. Turok's tip echoed in his mind, left flanks weaker. The beast was fast, relentless, but every strike overcommit, leaving a split-second gap. Ethan danced around him, staff slashing at Karoth's legs, drawing grunts but no blood. The skin healed almost instantly. The crowd jeered as he retreated, calling him coward, but he ignored them, baiting Karoth toward a cluster of jagged pillars. The champion swung again, and Ethan ducked, hurling the shock grenade at his feet. It burst in a crackling flash, staggering Karoth, but he recovered faster than VYX had, roaring as he lunged. Ethan sidestepped, aiming for the left flank. The staff's blade sank into a softer patch beneath Karoth's arm, green blood spurting free. The beast howled, swinging wildly, and Ethan pressed the advantage, striking again and again, joints, neck, anywhere the scars thinned. Minutes stretched into a brutal dance, Ethan's ribs screaming with every move, until Karoth's regeneration slowed. With a final thrust, Ethan drove the staff into the base of Karoth's skull, and the giant crashed to the ground, motionless but breathing. The arena fell silent, the air thick with disbelief. Ethan stood over his foe, chest heaving, blood dripping from a gash on his cheek. He looked up at Kaelith. She rose slowly, her expression unreadable, then raised her thumb. "The human prevails," she declared, her voice carrying a note he couldn't place. Respect, maybe, or something more. As guards hauled him away, Ethan caught her gaze lingering, her silhouette framed against the crimson sky. She'd underestimated him again, and he'd made her eat those words. Back in the spire, Ethan collapsed onto the cushioned platform, exhaustion pulling at him. Medics had patched his wounds with that tingling film, and a tray of food waited beside him, better than the protein slop of the cell block. He ate quickly, the flavors sharp and satisfying, then lay back, replaying the fight. Karoth had been a monster, but he'd found a way. He always did. The door hummed open, and Ethan sat up alert. Kaelith stepped inside, alone, her combat suit traded for those flowing robes again. The silver markings on her arms pulsed faintly, and her violet eyes glowed in the dim light. She closed the distance without a word, stopping at the edge of his platform, her presence filling the room. "You defeated Karoth," she said, her voice low, almost a purr. "No one's done that in cycles." Ethan met her stare, his pulse quickening. "Told you I had more than tricks." She leaned down, one hand bracing on the platform beside him, her face inches from his. "You're a puzzle, Carver," she murmured, her breath warm against his cheek. "Every piece I uncover surprises me." Her fingers brushed his shoulder, tracing the edge of a bruise, the touch light but deliberate. Heat flared where she touched, and Ethan's breath caught, his body tensing under her scrutiny. "Maybe I'm not what you expected," he said, voice rough, holding her gaze. Her lower eyes narrowed, the upper ones softening as she studied him. "No," she agreed, her hands sliding up to his neck, fingers grazing the pulse there. "You're not." Her thumb pressed lightly, feeling the rapid beat, and Ethan's hands clenched at his sides, resisting the urge to pull her closer or push her away. The air between them thickened, charged with unspoken things. She straightened abruptly, breaking the contact, but her eyes stayed on him, burning with that same intensity. "Tomorrow, you'll join me in the war chamber," she said. "We face a threat greater than the Crucible. Rest now. You've earned it." She turned to leave, her robes whispering against the floor, but paused at the door. "And Carver," she added, glancing back, "don't disappoint me." The door sealed behind her, and Ethan exhaled, the scent of her still lingering, storm and flowers, sharp and sweet. His skin tingled where she'd touched him, a reminder of how close she'd been, how close he'd wanted her to stay. He lay back, staring at the glowing ceiling, her words echoing in his mind. The Crucible was one thing. Whatever came next, with her, was another battle entirely. The next day, Tarak escorted him through the spire's labyrinthine halls to a vast chamber where Voryn warriors trained. The walls shimmered with energy, and the air crackled with the clash of weapons. Kaelith waited at the center, surrounded by her elite guard, her combat suit gleaming under the lights. She beckoned him over, her expression all business now, but Ethan couldn't shake the memory of her hand on his neck. "We train for war," she said, tossing him a staff. "The Arkon Collective moves against us, ruthless, efficient, beyond our borders. You'll fight with me today." Ethan caught the staff, nodding. "Let's do it." They sparred again, harder this time, their movements a blur of strikes and counters. She was stronger, faster, but he kept up, dodging her sweeps, landing a few hits that drew sharp breath from her. Then she closed in, slamming him to the mat, her body pinning his. Her chest pressed against his, her thighs locking his hips, and her face hovered above him, so close he could feel her breath, hot, ragged, alive. "Yield," she growled, but her grip softened, her fingers brushing his wrists where she held them. Ethan grinned, breathless. "Not yet." Her eyes flared, and for a heartbeat, she didn't move, their bodies pressed tight, heat building where they touched. Then she rolled off, standing with a huff, but the look she shot him was anything but cold. "Stubborn," she muttered, offering a hand. He took it, her grip firm as she pulled him up, their hands lingering a moment too long. "It's how I survive," he said, voice low. She smirked, stepping back. "We'll see." The training chamber pulsed with energy as Ethan pulled himself to his feet, Kaelith's hand still warm in his grasp. Her smirk lingered, a flicker of something playful in her violet eyes, but the air between them shifted as a low alarm echoed through the spire. The warriors around them froze, heads tilting toward the sound, and Kaelith's expression hardened instantly. She released his hand, her posture snapping back to the sovereign he'd first met, unyielding, commanding. "What's that?" Ethan asked, brushing sweat from his brow, his staff still clenched in his other hand. Kaelith's upper eye narrowed, the lower two scanning the chamber. "Perimeter alert," she said, voice clipped. "Something's breached the outer defenses." She turned to a guard, her crest flaring slightly. "Report." The guard tapped a device on his wrist, his three eyes blinking rapidly. "Sovereign, sensors detect an unidentified vessel, small, fast, inside the atmosphere. Sector 7. No response to hails. Itansku tightened. Arkon Collective?" Kaelith's gaze flicked to him, sharp and assessing. "Possibly. Their scouts don't announce themselves. They strike." She strode toward the chamber's exit, barking orders. "Mobilize the guard. Full sweep now. Carver with me." He fell in a step beside her, the guards parting as they moved through the spire's gleaming halls. Her pace was relentless, her robes swishing with every stride, and Ethan matched it, his mind racing. The Arkon Collective, ruthless, efficient, a shadow creeping across the galaxy. If they were here, this wasn't a drill. As they reached the war chamber, a vast room lined with holographic displays, Voryn officers scrambled to their stations, their voices a tense hum. The central hologram flared to life, showing a sleek, angular ship hovering just beyond the spire's shield grid. It was alone, its hull dark and unreflective, like a predator blending into the night. An older Voryn officer, his crest adorned with elaborate rank markings, stepped forward. Commander Drace. Ethan recalled from whispers in the training hall. Sovereign, Drace said, his tone tight. It's maintaining position. Scanning us, likely. No additional signatures yet. Kaelith crossed her arms, studying the display. They're testing us, she murmured, then glanced at Ethan. Your thoughts, Carver? Every head in the room turned, Drace's crest flattening in clear displeasure. Ethan ignored the stares, stepping closer to the hologram. If they wanted to fight, they'd hit hard and fast. This is bait, keeping your eyes here while they move elsewhere. He pointed to the southern edge of the grid. Any gaps in your shields there? Drace bristled. Our defenses are impenetrable. Check it. Kaelith cut in, her voice ablade. Full sensor sweep, southern hemisphere. Recalibrate for stealth signatures. The operators obeyed, their hands flying over controls. Moments later, a technician's voice broke the silence. Contact. 3 stealth craft, Sector 9, inside the grid. They slipped through during the last shield cycle. Drace's face darkened, his gray skin flushing a deeper shade. Ow! They're exploiting your routines, Ethan said, his tone calm but firm. That scout's a distraction. The real threat's already here. Kaelith's eyes gleamed with approval, though her expression remained stern. Tactical teams to Sector 9, she ordered. Capture, not kill. I want their tech intact. Carver, you're with me in the command hub. She turned, striding toward a raised platform, and Ethan followed, Drace's glare burning into his back. The hub buzzed with activity as Kaelith took her place at the center, Ethan at her side. Holograms shifted, showing the stealth craft, small, dart-like ships weaving through the spire's defenses. They're bold, she said, her voice low, meant for him alone. You saw this coming. It's what I do, Ethan replied, leaning closer to the display. Hit where they're not looking. Her shoulder brushed his as she adjusted the controls, a fleeting touch that sent a spark through him. But he kept his focus on the screens. Hours passed in a blur of strategy. Ethan's human perspective, unconventional by Voryn standards, proved uncanny. He spotted patterns in the Arkon movements, suggesting feints and counterstrikes that Kaelith implemented without hesitation. Drace objected at every turn, his voice sharp with distrust. The human compromises our security. But Kaelith silenced him with a look. By nightfall, 2 of his stealth craft were downed, their crews captured, while the 3rd exploded in a failed escape. The scout ship vanished beyond the system's edge, leaving the spire intact. A victory, Drace declared, his tone grudging as the officers dispersed. Kaelith shook her head. A skirmish, not a win. They'll be back. She turned to Ethan, her voice softening slightly. You were invaluable today, Carver. Drace wrong. You're no threat. Ethan met her gaze, the weight of her words settling over him. I'm not here to betray you. I just want to survive. She stepped closer, her height forcing him to tilt his head. You do more than survive, she said, her hand resting briefly on his arm, fingers pressing through the fabric. You think like no Voryn I've met. The touch lingered, warm and firm, and Ethan's pulse quickened, her closeness stirring something he couldn't name. Before he could respond, alarms blared again, shrill, urgent. The hub's lights flickered red, and security barriers slammed into place. Perimeter breach, an officer shouted. Eastern Spire entrance, multiple hostiles armed. Kaelith's crest flared, her demeanor shifting to steel. Lock it down, she snapped, then grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him toward the exit. Stay with me. They raced through the corridors, guards falling in behind them as blasts echoed in the distance. The air grew thick with smoke and the tang of scorched metal. Arkon, Ethan asked, keeping pace. Or worse, Kaelith replied, her grip tightening. This is too coordinated. They rounded a corner, and chaos erupted. Voryn soldiers clashed with intruders, tall, sleek figures in black armor, their weapons spitting blue energy. Ethan ducked a stray bolt, pulling Kaelith behind a pillar as the fight spilled toward them. Her body pressed against his, her breath ragged against his neck, and for a heartbeat, they were tangled in the shadows, her heat seeping through his tunic. "You hurt?" he asked, voice low, his hand sliding to her waist to steady her. "I'm fine," she growled, but her fingers dug into his shoulder, her eyes blazing with something raw. "We need to move." The skirmish was fierce but brief. Loyal guards overwhelmed the intruders, their bodies crumpling under Voryn blades. As the smoke cleared, Kaelith stepped out, Ethan at her side, and a chilling sight greeted them. One of the fallen wore a Voryn crest, Drace insignia. "Traitor," Kaelith hissed, her voice trembling with fury. She knelt beside the body, ripping the crest free, then stood, her gaze locking onto Ethan's. "Someone inside turned on us." Ethan's mind raced. "Drace!" "Or one of his," she said, her hand clenching the crest until her knuckles paled. This wasn't just Arkon. This was planned. A guard approached, breathless. "Sovereign, the eastern wing secure. But reports say more hostiles are massing outside the grid. We're under siege." Kaelith's eyes narrowed, but she nodded. "Fortify the defenses." "Carver, we're going to the armory. I need you armed." They moved quickly, the halls eerily quiet now, the distant rumble of conflict growing louder. The armory was a cavernous space, its walls lined with Voryn weaponry, blades, rifles, things Ethan couldn't name. Kaelith handed him a sleek pulse rifle, her fingers brushing his as she adjusted his grip. "Like this," she said, stepping behind him, her chest grazing his back. Her hands guided his, firm and steady, and Ethan felt her breath against his ear, a shiver running through him. "Got it," he managed, voice rough, hyper-aware of her body pressed to his. She lingered a moment, then stepped away, grabbing a pair of blades for herself. "We fight together now," she said, her tone fierce but her eyes softening. "No more trials, just survival." Ethan nodded, the rifle heavy in his hands. "Together, then?" They exited the armory as the spire shook, a deep boom reverberating through the stone. Kaelith grabbed his arm again, pulling him toward the command hub. "They're hitting the shield generators," she said, her voice urgent. "If those fall, we're done." The hub was a frenzy of motion, officers shouting over the din of alarms. The holograms showed a swarm of Arkon ships descending, their sleek forms cutting through the red sky. But worse, internal sensors flashed red, marking breaches across the spire. "Sabotage," Ethan said, pointing to the grid. "Someone's opened the gates from inside." Kaelith's face darkened, her crest flaring fully now. "Drace," she spat. "He sold us out." Before she could say more, the hub's doors exploded inward, and Drace himself stormed in, flanked by a dozen Voryn in black armor. Traitors, their crests defaced. His eyes locked onto Kaelith, a sneer twisting his scarred face. "Your reign ends here, Sovereign," he growled. "The Arkon offer a better future." Ethan raised his rifle, stepping in front of Kaelith. "Over my dead body." Drace laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "That could be arranged, human." Kaelith's blades flashed as she moved beside Ethan, her shoulder brushing his. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice ice cold. The traitors charged, and the fight erupted. The war chamber erupted into chaos as Drace traitors charged, their black armor glinting under the flickering lights. Ethan fired his pulse rifle, the weapon's kick jarring his shoulder as a bolt slammed into the chest of the nearest Voryn, dropping him instantly. Beside him, Kaelith moved like a storm, her twin blades slicing through the air, cutting down a second attacker in a spray of green blood. Their shoulders brushed as they fought back-to-back, a rhythm forming between them, his precise shots covering her fluid strikes. Drace roared, swinging a massive energy axe toward Kaelith. She ducked, the blade grazing her crest, and countered with a slash that forced him back. Ethan pivoted, firing at a traitor lunging for her flank, the bolt searing through its armor. "Thanks," she grunted, her voice tight, her eyes flicking to his for a heartbeat. "Anytime," Ethan replied, reloading as another wave rushed them. The fight was brutal, close quarters, no room for hesitation. Ethan's rifle ran dry, and he dropped it, snatching a fallen Voryn blade from the floor. It was heavier than he liked, but he adapted, parrying a strike and driving the edge into his attacker's gut. Kaelith fought Drace head-on, their clash a whirlwind of sparks and fury. Ethan caught glimpses, her strength, her grace, until a traitor tackled him, slamming him against the hologram table. Pain flared in his ribs, but he twisted, kneeing the Voryn's midsection and shoving the blade up through its jaw. It collapsed, and Ethan staggered to his feet, blood streaking his face. Across the room, Kaelith pinned Drace against a wall, one blade at his throat, the other poised to strike. "Why?" she hissed, her voice raw with betrayal. Drace sneered, his 3 eyes glinting with malice. "You've grown weak, Kaelith, consorting with this human filth. The Arkon will cleanse us, elevate us. You sold your people for power," she spat, her blade pressing harder, drawing a thin line of blood. Ethan stepped closer, blade ready, but Kaelith shook her head slightly, a silent order to stand down. "This is mine," she said, her gaze never leaving Drace. With a swift twist, she drove her second blade into his chest, and he slumped, lifeless, his axe clattering to the floor. The remaining traitors faltered, their resolve breaking as loyal guards stormed the hub, cutting them down. Silence fell, heavy and blood-soaked, broken only by the hum of the holograms. Kaelith straightened, wiping her blades on Drace's cloak, her chest heaving. She turned to Ethan, her violet eyes blazing with a mix of rage and relief. "You're still standing," she said, her voice softening. "Barely," he replied, wiping blood from his lip, a faint grin tugging at his mouth. She stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm, fingers lingering on a cut there. "You fought well," she murmured, her touch warm against his skin, sending a shiver through him despite the chaos. "For me. For us," he corrected, meeting her gaze, the air between them thickening with unspoken heat. A guard interrupted, breathless. "Sovereign, the Arkon fleet's breaching the outer grid, dozens of ships. The generators are failing." Kaelith's expression hardened, but her hand stayed on Ethan's arm a moment longer before dropping. "To the command deck," she ordered, striding out, Ethan at her heels. The command deck was a maelstrom of panic and resolve. Holograms showed the Arkon fleet descending, sleek, predatory ships tearing through the spire's weakening shields. Officers shouted updates. Generator 3's down. Enemy landing craft in Sector 4. Kaelith took the central platform, her presence steadying the room, while Ethan scanned the displays, his mind racing for a way out. "They're overwhelming us," he said, pointing to the swarm. "But they're bunched up, too tight. Hit them with a spread attack, scatter them." Kaelith nodded, barking orders. "Redirect all cannons. Wide dispersal pattern now." The spire's defenses roared to life, beams of energy lancing into the Arkon formation, blasting ships apart. The enemy faltered, their tight ranks breaking, but more poured in, relentless. Ethan spotted a flicker on the sensors, a faint signal from beyond the system. "Wait," he said, zooming in. "That's a Union frequency. My people, they're here." Kaelith's eyes widened, a rare flicker of surprise. "You called them. Didn't know if they'd come," he admitted, hope surging. "Sent a distress ping days ago, when I found my gear in the Crucible." The hologram shifted, revealing a Terran Union fleet, smaller than the Arkon's but fast, agile, emerging from hyperspace. Their ships dove into the fray, missiles streaking toward the enemy, catching them off guard. Cheers erupted from the Voryn officers, but Kaelith's focus stayed on Ethan, her expression unreadable. "You're full of surprises," she said, stepping close, her hip brushing his as she adjusted the display. Her voice dropped, meant for him alone. "I underestimated you." "Won't be the last time," he replied, a spark igniting in his chest as her hand grazed his, lingering there. The battle raged outside, Union and Voryn forces sinking in a desperate dance. Ethan coordinated with the Terran commander via a patched comms link, his tactics, feints, ambushes, meshing with Kaelith's brute force commands. The Arkon fleet thinned, ships retreating under the combined assault, but the spire shook again, a deep groan signaling structural damage. "They're targeting the core," an officer shouted. "If it goes, we're finished." Kaelith grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him toward a side console. "We need to vent the auxiliary power, reroute it to the shields." Her fingers flew over the controls, and Ethan leaned in, his chest brushing her back as he helped, their movements frantic but in sync. Her breath hitched, her shoulder pressing against his, and for a moment, the chaos faded, leaving only the heat between them. "Got it," he said, voice rough, as the system flared green, shields stabilizing. She turned her head, their faces inches apart, her violet eyes burning into his. "You're saving us," she whispered, her hand sliding to his waist, gripping tight. "We're saving each other," he corrected, his own hand resting on hers, the contact electric. The spire steadied, the Arkon retreat accelerating as Union ships pursued. The command deck erupted in relieved shouts, but Kaelith and Ethan stayed locked in that moment, the world narrowing to the space between them. She pulled back slowly, her touch lingering, then straightened, addressing the room. "The threat's pushed back for now. Carver's proven his worth beyond doubt." The officers nodded, some with grudging respect, others with awe. Ethan caught his breath, the weight of her words sinking in. He wasn't just a prisoner or a guest anymore. He was her ally, maybe more. As the crew dispersed, Kaelith beckoned him to a quiet corner, her expression softening. "You called your fleet," she said, her voice low. "Risked everything." "Had to," he replied, stepping closer. "We're in this together now." Her hand brushed his chest, fingers splaying over his heart, feeling its rapid beat. "Yes," she agreed, her gaze intense, vulnerable. Together, a distant explosion rumbled, a reminder of the war still raging beyond the spire. But here, in this stolen moment, something shifted. Her thumb traced a slow arc across his chest, and Ethan's hand covered hers, holding it there, the unspoken promise between them sealing tighter than any vow. The command deck quieted as the last echoes of battle faded, the distant rumble of retreating Arkon ships swallowed by the vastness of space. Ethan stood in the shadowed corner with Kaelith, her hand still pressed to his chest, her thumb tracing that slow, deliberate arc over his racing heart. Her violet eyes held his, fierce yet softened by something unguarded, a crack in the Sovereign's armor he hadn't seen before. His own hand rested over hers, anchoring it there, the warmth of her touch seeping through his tunic. For a moment, the chaos of the spire, the blood and betrayal, melted away, leaving only the electric pull between them. "Together," Kaelith repeated, her voice a whisper that vibrated through him. She leaned closer, her breath brushing his lips, and Ethan felt the air thicken, his pulse hammering louder than any alarm. Her fingers curled slightly, nails grazing his chest through the fabric, and he tightened his grip on her hand, torn between pulling her in or holding the line. A sharp cough broke the spell. Tarak stood a few paces away, his three eyes blinking in sequence, a faint smirk tugging at his scarred face. "Sovereign, the Union commander's hailing us," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "They're requesting a parley." Kaelith straightened, her hand slipping from Ethan's chest, leaving a lingering heat. "Patch them through," she said, her voice snapping back to command. She glanced at Ethan, a flicker of something, regret, promise, in her gaze before turning to the central hologram. Ethan exhaled, steadying himself as the display flared to life. A Terran officer appeared, her dark hair pulled tight in a military bun, her uniform crisp despite the battle scars on her ship's bridge behind her. "This is Captain Mira Henshaw, Terran Union Fleet," she said, her voice firm. "Lieutenant Carver, you're alive." "Barely," Ethan replied, stepping into view. "Good to see you, Captain." Henshaw's eyes flicked to Kaelith, assessing. "We picked up your distress signal. Figured you were dead when it cut off. Then we caught Arkon chatter about a human in Voryn space. What's the situation?" Ethan glanced at Kaelith, who nodded slightly. "I'm with Sovereign Kaelith, ruler of the Voryn Expanse," he said. "The Arkon Collective hit us hard. Internal sabotage opened the door. We've pushed them back, but they're not done. Your timing saved us." Henshaw's brow furrowed. "And the Voryn? Allies or captors?" "Allies," Kaelith interjected, stepping beside Ethan, her shoulder brushing his. "Your lieutenant's proven his worth. We propose a partnership, our strength, your ingenuity, against a mutual enemy." Henshaw hesitated, then nodded. "I'll need to clear it with command, but I'll vouch for it. The Arkon are a threat we can't ignore. Carver, you're okay with this?" Ethan met Kaelith's gaze, her closeness stirring that same heat. "Yeah," he said. "It's our best shot." "Stand by," Henshaw said, and the hologram winked out. Kaelith turned to Ethan, her expression softening again. "You trust your people to agree?" "They'll see the logic," he replied, his voice low. "Arkon won't stop at Voryn. They'll come for Earth next." She studied him, then gestured to the officers still milling about. "Leave us," she ordered, her tone brooking no argument. The room emptied, Turok lingering last with a knowing glance before shutting the door. Alone now, Kaelith moved closer, her hand finding his arm again, fingers tracing the edge of a bruise. "You risked everything for us," she said, her voice quiet, intimate. Ethan's breath hitched as her touch slid up to his shoulder, her nails grazing his neck. "Had to," he said, stepping into her space, their bodies nearly touching. "You'd have done the same." Her lips parted, a faint smile breaking through. "Maybe." She tilted her head, her crest catching the light, and her hand slid to his chest again, splaying wide. "You're not what I expected, Carver." "Not at all." He covered her hand with his, pressing it harder against him. "Good," he murmured, his other hand brushing her waist, feeling the muscle beneath her robes. Her breath caught, her violet eyes darkening, and for a heartbeat, they stood there, teetering on the edge of something neither could name. The comms beeped, shattering the moment. Kaelith pulled back, her hand lingering on his chest before dropping. "Duty calls," she said, a wry edge to her tone, and moved to the console. Henshaw reappeared, her expression grim. "Command's on board, provisional alliance. But there's a catch. The Arkon sent a transmission, encrypted, but we cracked it. They're boasting about a weapon, something that'll rend stars apart. No details, just a warning to surrender or burn." Kaelith's crest flared. "A bluff?" "Doubt it," Ethan said, joining her at the console, their shoulders brushing again. They retreated too fast, saving strength for something bigger. Henshaw nodded. "We're sending a diplomatic team to the Spire. Carver, you're our liaison. Sovereign, we'll need your specs on the Arkon. Everything you've got." "Agreed," Kaelith said. "We'll prepare a briefing. Stand by for coordinates." The hologram faded, and Kaelith turned to Ethan, her expression a mix of resolve and something softer. "Liaison," she mused, stepping closer. "You're staying, then?" "Looks like it," he replied, his hand brushing hers, fingers intertwining briefly before pulling back. "We've got work to do." She smirked, a glint in her eyes. "More than you know." The next hours blurred into preparations. Ethan worked with Voryn techs, syncing Union comms with their systems, while Kaelith rallied her commanders, her presence a steady anchor. The Spire's wounds were patched, shields reinforced, generators humming again, but the air crackled with unease. The Arkon's threat hung over them, a shadow no victory could dispel. As night fell, Kaelith summoned Ethan to a balcony overlooking the city, its jagged spires glowing under the red sky. She stood at the edge, robes billowing in the wind, her silhouette stark against the crimson haze. "You've seen my world now," she said as he joined her, her voice low. What do you think? Ethan leaned on the railing, their arms brushing. Beautiful, he said, glancing at her. Dangerous. Not so different from home. She turned, her hip grazing his as she faced him fully. And this alliance, your people, mine, you believe in it. I do, he said, meeting her gaze. We're stronger together. Arkon won't expect it. Her hand found his, fingers lacing through his, her grip firm yet tender. Nor did I expect you, she admitted, her voice dropping, her thumb stroking his knuckles. Ethan's pulse raced, her touch igniting a fire he'd barely kept banked. He stepped closer, his free hand resting on her waist, feeling the curve beneath the fabric. Kaelith, he started, his voice rough, but she silenced him with a look, her violet eyes searching his. Ethan, she said, the first time she'd used his name, and it hit him like a punch. Her hand slid up his arm, cupping his neck, pulling him in until their foreheads touched. It's forbidden. My council, my laws, they'd never allow it. Screw the laws, he murmured, his hand tightening on her waist, pulling her flush against him. Her breath hitched, her chest pressing to his, and for a moment they stood there, bodies locked, the world fading to nothing. Then she kissed him, slow, fierce, her lips firm yet yielding, tasting of storm and spice. Ethan kissed her back, his hand sliding up her back, fingers tangling in the base of her crest. She groaned softly, her nails digging into his neck, and the kiss deepened, a collision of need and defiance. When they broke apart, gasping, her eyes burned with a promise. We'll face them together, she said, her voice raw. Arkon, my counsel, all of it. Together, he echoed, his hand still on her back, holding her close. The Union delegation arrived at dawn, their ships landing in the Spire's courtyard amid a flurry of Voryn guards. Henshaw led the team, her handshake firm as she greeted Ethan and Kaelith. The briefing chamber filled with officers from both sides, holograms displaying Arkon movements and the cryptic threat of their weapon. Ethan stood at Kaelith's side, translating human tactics for her commanders, while she outlined Voryn's strengths, raw power tempered by his ingenuity. A Voryn elder, his crest gray with age, spoke up, voice trembling with doubt. Sovereign, a human as liaison? Can we trust him? Kaelith's gaze hardened, but her hand brushed Ethan's under the table, a secret anchor. He saved us twice, once in the Crucible, once against Drace and Arkon. I trust him with my life. Ethan cleared his throat, meeting the elder's stare. I'm here to protect my people and yours. The Arkon don't care about borders. They'll burn us all unless we stand as one. Henshaw nodded. He's right. This alliance is our edge. The room murmured, tension easing into cautious agreement. Later, in a quiet meeting room, Ethan and Kaelith pored over plans for Earth, a diplomatic mission to seal the pact. We'll show them the Arkon threat, Ethan said, leaning over a hologram of Earth's blue-green sphere. Prove this benefits both worlds. Kaelith stood beside him, her arm brushing his. And I'll show them strength isn't just blades, it's unity. Her voice softened. We'll rewrite what they think of us. He smiled, their hands finding each other again. Starting with us. That night, under the Spire's red sky, they walked the courtyard, the air cool and still. Today was a beginning, Kaelith said, her fingers tracing his palm. For Voryn, for Earth, for us. Ethan pulled her close, her body fitting against his. Just the start, he agreed, his lips brushing her crest. As they stood together, a Union ship streaked overhead, a harbinger of the bridge they'd build. The Arkon loomed, their weapon a dark promise. But here, in this moment, hope burned brighter. A new dawn forged in blood, trust, and something deeper, binding human and Voryn against the stars.